All right, this is part 3 of our lecture, Blitz Through the Ancient Near East, and we're going to run through the early Bronze Age. And basically what I'm going to do in the remaining pieces of this lecture is talk about Egypt, Mesopotamia, and Palestine in each of the periods. The early Bronze Age ran from approximately 3000 down to 2000 or 1800, give or take a couple centuries. Again, the early Bronze Age, and these are some wider numbers, and you'll see the numbers vary. There's always a question of exactly when one age starts, one age ends. Usually they break due to cataclysmic events. But let's start in Mesopotamia. And the earliest people to build a civilization and organize it in Mesopotamia were the Sumerians. Now, the Sumerians lived in southern Mesopotamia. They're going to be in the same region that the Babylonians will end up being in centuries later. The Sumerians are an interesting people. They have an Indo-European language. So they perhaps came somewhere maybe from the Indus River Valley and where India would be, but they came from the outside. Most of the people groups that we're going to be dealing with, except really the Sumerians, were Semitic-speaking peoples. And the Sumerians founded some city-states, Ur, which we'll know from later times that's where Abram ultimately was from, Ur of the Chaldees, the scriptures say. Ur, Erech, Nippur were some early city-states. The Sumerians had kings, and what's interesting about their kings is one of the ancient documents that you can check out is the Sumerian Kings List. And in that they have kings that had incredibly lengthy reigns. Again, reigns that were so long that they make the numbers in the Genesis genealogies seem normal. So some of the kings reigned for literally thousands of years, so that helps to give us some backdrop on the length of ages like we see in Genesis. That was definitely common to the culture of the times. And in fact, Sumerian culture was the high culture of the ancient Near East for a long time, and in the Sumerian period their culture was very influential, and people look back on those as a sort of a golden age. Now after the Sumerians, the next group that comes along were the Akkadians. The Akkadians give us a language that ends up being the lingua franca of the ancient Near East for millennia after they disappear. Some of the more well-known kings would be persons like Sargon the Great, Naram-Sin. And the Akkadians are important for understanding something about the ancient Near East because they're the first people group in the ancient Near East who had ideas about world empire. In other words, we're going to see a recurring pattern throughout the splits of a people group seeking to dominate their neighbors and control the entire Fertile Crescent. The Akkadians were the first to have wind of this idea, and their kings such as Sargon and Naram-Sin claimed to have conquered the whole world. Of course they didn't, but they're the first to actually campaign outside of their borders and go around and collect tribute and try to dominate their neighbors. Now let's go back to Egypt. Egypt during the early Bronze Age is the era of the Old Kingdom, and we're going to see Egypt's really breaking into three major sections: Old Kingdom, Middle Kingdom, New Kingdom, with intermediate periods between those things. But essentially, the Egyptian Empire, the Old Kingdom, was the union of Upper and Lower Egypt into one unified people by the Pharaoh. And the Pharaoh was the Egyptian name for the king, and it's during the Old Kingdom period that the Great Pyramids were actually built. So think about that. Almost a millennia, or more than a millennia before the Israelites end up in the Promised Land, there's already great pyramids standing in Egypt, along with a very complex and complicated writing system known as hieroglyphics that exist, again, millennia before any of the Bible's even written. Now when we look at Syria-Palestine, which is where the biblical narrative of Israel is going to take place for the most part, there's no Israelites there yet, but there are cities, already cities such as Jericho, and Jericho goes way back, perhaps 8000 BC, Megiddo. There are already cities that we're going to see later in the Bible that are already standing there. And these are city-states, which we saw that word back in with the Sumerians. But city-states are essentially freestanding cities that essentially govern themselves and control some of the territory and the farmland around the immediate vicinity of that city. Now the highlights. When we look back at early bronze, we want to again say that this was the golden age of culture. Again, this is the time of the Great Pyramids. This is the time of the Sumerian culture. And in the ancient Near East, unlike the modern world where we tend to think things are always getting better, in the ancient world there was a much more appreciation for the past, and it was thought that the past was the golden age. Sometimes we get that sense, like in the United States, for example, sometimes we glorify, say, 1950s as a real cultural moment. But in the ancient world, they always looked to the past as the golden age, whereas I think in the present we tend to be more future oriented. So when you read the Old Testament, sometimes we're looking backwards instead of forwards. You just have to remember that perspective. We also see with the Akkadians the beginning of a trend towards world domination, which we'll see that theme repeatedly as we go through the course of our lecture and our review of history. In Israel, notice Israel's not here yet. Israel's a late comer to the game. So it's really important to think through what it means that God allowed human cultures to grow and to be really important and vibrant. And his mission to bring the gospel really isn't going to start until Abram. Quite fascinating. And Abram's, we're not going to see him until the Middle Bronze Age. So there's already complicated and complex cultures and people groups in the ancient world long before Abram is called into as the beginning part of the gospel.